There is a German submarine sitting in the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. It has been there since 1954, displayed on land in a landlocked American city, far from the Atlantic approaches, where it was built to operate, and far from the West African waters, where it was finally captured. School children walk around it. They read the plaques. They look at the cramped interior, the instrument panels, the sleeping quarters designed for fewer men than the boat eventually carried. The submarine is called the U-505. It is one of the very few German U-boats to survive the war intact, and it survived intact because it was captured rather than sunk, because on a specific day in June 1944, off the coast of West Africa, the crew of a German submarine and the crew of an American carrier force found themselves in one of those moments that the machinery of war occasionally produces, where the question of what happens next is determined not by policy or ideology, but by the specific decisions of specific men in a span of seconds. This is a story about what happens after that moment. Not the official history of the capture, though the official history is remarkable in its own right, but the longer story, the one that doesn't fit easily into the operational record. The story of two men who were on opposite sides of that encounter, who carried it with them for 38 years, and who eventually sat down together in a room and talked about what they remembered. To understand what a German submarine was, in the context of the Second World War, it is necessary to understand what the Battle of the Atlantic was, and what the Battle of the Atlantic was, at its core, was a question about whether Britain could survive. Britain was an island at war required supply ships. Supply ships required sea lanes. Sea lanes in the Northern Atlantic in 1940 and 1941 and 1942 were contested by German U-boats in a campaign that came closer than any other single operational theater to determining the outcome of the entire war. Churchill would say afterward that the U-boat menace was the one thing that had truly frightened him during the war, not the Blitz, not the fall of France, not the possibility of invasion, but the slow, grinding, statistical attrition of tonnage that the U-boats were applying to the supply lines, and that in the worst months of 1942 was approaching the threshold at which Britain might simply run out of the materials needed to continue. The men who crewed the U-boats understood the mathematics of their own situation. The statistics were known to anyone willing to read the operational records, and the operational records were not hidden from the men who were accumulating them. Of the 39,000 men who served in the German submarine force during the war, approximately 32,000 were killed at sea. The survival rate for U-boat crews, calculated across the full duration of the war, was approximately 18%. A young man who put on a submariner's uniform in 1939 and looked honestly at what the numbers meant was looking at a situation in which his most likely outcome, by a wide margin, was death. Hans Göbeler joined the German Navy at 17. He was from Hamburg, the son of a man who had been out of work for 4 years during the Depression before Hitler came to power, and who, like most German working class that had lived through the specific humiliation of unemployment and want and the structural collapse of the Weimar economy, had voted for the man who promised that the suffering would end. Göbeler was 6 in 1928, old enough to understand that there was not enough bread. He was 11 when his father found work. He was 15 when the war started. He had been in the Hitler Youth, as every German boy his age had been. He said this plainly, with the specificity of a man who understood that the honest account of that period required acknowledging what everyone of his generation had participated in. Any German of his age who said otherwise, he said, was lying. Everyone, the Hitler Youth, had offered things that were genuinely appealing to a boy who had grown up without much: organized activities, travel, the sense of belonging to something that was larger than the cramped apartment and the bread with margarine. These were not, in his telling, the things he thought about when he joined. He was 15. He thought about the Navy. The U-505 was the boat he joined when he was 17. By the time he came aboard, the Atlantic campaign had turned against the German submarine force. The technology, the convoy discipline, the air cover provided by the growing Allied maritime patrol fleet, the deployment of support carrier groups specifically designed to hunt submarines. All of these had shifted the balance. The boats that had gone out in 1940 and 1941 and returned with their kill tonnage flags flying had been gradually replaced by boats that went out and did not come back, their fates confirmed only by the silence. U-124 didn't come back. U-542 didn't come back. The gaps in the berths multiplied. A submariner in 1943 and 1944 was not living in the certainty of eventual victory. He was living in the certainty of eventual death, qualified only by the uncertainty of timing. The U-505, by June 1944, had sailed through the Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, through the Panama Canal, and down toward the West African coast. The boat had seen 3 commanders. The second commander, 25 years old, who had made 10 war patrols by his mid-20s, had killed himself during a depth charge attack. The pressure, Göbeler thought, had simply been too much for a man of that age to carry. The responsibility for 50 lives in a steel tube at depth, with the explosions working their way through the water around you, and the instruments telling you things that required immediate and correct interpretation, there was a threshold, and this man had reached it. And the threshold had not held. June 4, 1944, was 2 days before D-Day. Göbeler was standing in the conning tower beside the commander when the periscope went up and the commander began counting ships. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and a 6th larger vessel forming a wide circle around the submarine's position. The task force was a hunter-killer group built around the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, under the command of Captain Daniel Gallery, a man who had been specifically ordered by the Navy Department to find and capture, rather than sink, a German U-boat, so that the Enigma materials and the code books aboard could be examined and exploited. The commander said, "Take the locks off. Prepare to surface." He opened the valves. The U-505 came up into the daylight with the Guadalcanal's aircraft and destroyer escorts already in position. Fire opened immediately. What followed in the next minutes was a sequence of events that the official record and the personal memories of the men involved do not entirely agree on in their details, but agree on in their outcome. 58 of the 59 men aboard the U-505 survived. 1 man was killed. The ceasefire came quickly. Whether it came quickly because Gallery had instructed his men to preserve the crew for intelligence purposes, or because the officers on the scene made that judgment themselves in the moment, or because the situation was resolved quickly enough that the question was no longer relevant, the accounts vary. What does not vary is that 58 men were pulled out of the Atlantic. Göbeler remembered the wave that took him away from the lifeboat. He remembered the rubber raft. He remembered coming alongside the American destroyer and seeing for the first time in his life a black man's face, one of the mess stewards, who reached down and pulled him from the water and offered him chewing tobacco and took him inside and gave him cake, and was then shouted at by a petty officer for having taken the German prisoner into the wrong section of the ship. Göbeler, who had grown up in the specific racial cosmology of Nazi Germany, was frightened at first, and then was given cake, and the fear began to dissolve into something that required more thinking than he had been trained to do. James Sanders was 25 in June 1944, a junior flight officer on the Guadalcanal. He had wanted to fight the war and get it over with. He had felt, with the directness of a young man who has not complicated his convictions yet, that the German system had to be ended, and Hitler had to be removed, and the only way to accomplish this was to fight until it was accomplished. He was not thinking about the specific men on the specific submarine when the task force closed in. He was thinking about the operational objective. When the surviving crew of the U-505 was brought aboard, Sanders and the other sailors lined the rail and looked at them. He remembered being surprised by what he saw. These were not the faces of men who looked as if they were having bad luck. Some of them were smiling. They appeared to him to be relieved, as if the specific weight of what they had been carrying, the certainty of eventual death qualified only by the uncertainty of when, had been lifted in the moment the surrender was completed. Gallery had issued strict orders against fraternization. His concern was specific and practical. Among 58 German submariners, there might be fanatical men, and fanatical men in proximity to American officers who carried sidearms might attempt to acquire those weapons. He was not afraid of losing the ship. He was afraid of losing a few men unnecessarily. The sailors on the Guadalcanal disregarded the orders as much as they could, in the specific way that young men with access to a group of other young men on the other side of a wire screen tend to disregard instructions that feel, in the immediate human context, less compelling than the obvious possibility of conversation. The guard who had been assigned to watch Göbeler gave him his home address. He told the German prisoner that when the war was over they would write to each other. He gave his name and his parents' address in a country that was currently trying to kill the man he was guarding. Göbeler carried the address out of the Atlantic and through 4 years of captivity in the United States, picking cotton and cutting wood in Louisiana for $1 a day, making model submarines to trade for Coca-Cola and cigarettes, watching the local population move from fear to something more ordinary. As the weeks passed, and the German prisoners demonstrated that they were, in the words Göbeler used, the same people as they were. Then England, 2 more years. Then home in December 1947, 3.5 years after the war had ended. When he got home, he wrote to the address the guard had given him. A few months later, a letter came back from the man's parents. He had been killed a year after the encounter, somewhere in the Pacific. Göbeler held this. He held it the way he held other things from those years, with the specificity of a man who has learned that the record matters, that the details matter, that the things which happen to specific people in specific circumstances cannot be adequately contained by the general categories that history uses when it wants to describe the war in tractable terms. The U-505's capture was kept secret for months. The German submarine command, unable to account for the boat's disappearance through any of the normal channels, eventually sent notification to the families of the crew. They must be dead. Göbeler's mother was ill. He was her only son. She did not accept the notification. She told her husband, he must be alive. She had a feeling. She was correct, and she would not know it for nearly 4 years. When Göbeler returned to Germany in December 1947, he called ahead from the railway station rather than simply appearing at the door. If he had appeared without warning at the door, he thought, something could have happened to his mother. He called first. He had learned, in the years in between, something about the management of moments that the circumstances surrounding him had not provided the infrastructure to manage safely. In Chicago, in September 1982, at the museum where the U-505 was displayed on land, the surviving members of both crews held a reunion. Sanders and Göbeler sat together and talked. The conversation was, in some sense, the conversation that the war had interrupted and that 38 years had finally made possible. A conversation between 2 men who had been 21 and 25 respectively on June 4, 1944, who had been positioned on opposite sides of the same encounter, and who had had the time since then to think about what the encounter had actually meant. What it meant, at the level that both men could agree on, was more straightforward than the official categories of war and peace suggested. Göbeler had never looked at the Americans as personal enemies. He had put up his 3 fingers and given his oath, and he had served because the oath required it, and he had hoped to live through the war, because the alternative was clearly stated in the statistics he had been accumulating since the first boats stopped coming back. He had not been willing to die for Hitler. He had been willing to do his duty. These were not, in his understanding, the same thing. Sanders had no personal hostility toward the German people. He had wanted the system ended. He had wanted the man responsible for it removed. He had understood these as the necessary conditions for the resumption of a world that was organized around something other than that system and that man. He had not been fighting the people in the water, what they shared, and what the conversation in Chicago in 1982 seemed to circle around without either of them saying it in precisely these terms, was the specific knowledge of what it is like to be young and in danger in a machine built for the purpose of killing, and to have the machine stop, and to find yourself still alive on the other side of it, with the rest of your life in front of you, and the question of what to do with it, open in a way that the years before had not allowed. Göbeler had drawn pictures of submarines in Louisiana, exchanging the drawings for cigarettes and Coca-Cola. He had learned to talk to the Texas farmer who later wrote him letters. He had come home and found his mother still alive, her certainty confirmed, and he had eventually found his way to Chicago and to a conversation with the man whose task force had pulled him from the Atlantic. Sanders had watched the guards on the Guadalcanal sit with the young German survivor through the wire screen, talking like two kids who grew up in the same neighborhood. He had not talked to the German prisoners himself. He didn't want the sailors to see him breaking orders, but he had watched, and what he had watched had produced in him an understanding that did not require philosophical elaboration. The technology of war creates maximum distance between the people it is designed to kill. The submarine and the carrier task force represent that distance. You cannot see the face of the man you are trying to destroy. You act on information, on tactical data, on the presence of something that has been categorized as a threat. The wire screen and the chewing tobacco and the cake represent the opposite of that distance. Two people in proximity, with the war temporarily suspended, discovering that the categories do not hold. Göbeler said, "Now, I sit here and I only think Jim is my friend." Sanders said, "There is a maturing with 38 years. Both of these things were true. Both of them required the 38 years to become fully true. The years of captivity and return, and the management of the ordinary life that follows extraordinary events, and the accumulation of evidence that the categories used during the war were not adequate to the reality they had been applied to." The U-505 is still in Chicago. The plaques explain the capture. They do not explain what happened afterward, because what happened afterward does not fit on a plaque. It took 38 years and a reunion and two men sitting down together to begin to explain what happened afterward. And even then the explanation was incomplete, because the explanation of what survives a war and what it becomes is always incomplete. The guard gave Göbeler his address. He was killed in the Pacific a year later. The parents wrote back. The letter arrived. That is also part of what happened. That is also what the war left behind.